The title of this seminar this afternoon, which will be going from 1 to 3, is the Swedish Carbon Budget Challenge, Turning Paris into Local Climate Action. And it will be divided into more or less 3 parts. We will watch a short film, which you just saw a small part of to begin with, and then we'll hear Kevin Anderson, who's Zenson Professor in Climate Change Leadership at Uppsala University, give a talk, and then we will have a panel with a number of interesting panelists that I will present at a later time. And what we will begin with is thinking about this question of the relationship between the international level, the national level, and the local level. And for the last 2 weeks, our professor here, Kevin, has been cycling around Sweden and visiting municipalities and counties, län, kommuner, but also civil society around Sweden to talk about climate change. And the first thing that we hope to be able to show you now is a short film that I hope the sound will work for. But just before we do that, just to let you know that this is the hashtag on Twitter that we have been using during this 2-week cycle tour. It's Carbon Cycle Sweden, so you can use that hashtag today if you want to tweet, if you're into tweeting. And you can also reach us at Simus Uppsala and also Kevin directly at Kevin Climate at those handles. So this film is about an 8-minute video that was put together just this weekend by our colleague Ingrid Rieser. And it's more or less produced by Kevin along with people in Sweden, around Sweden, that have sent in videos, and also Kevin having done filming during these two past weeks. We thought that would be a good way to sort of start this seminar by showing some reflections, both from Kevin but other people around Sweden, about where we're at on climate change and what's happening around Sweden. So that's the first thing we'll do, and hopefully the sound will reach even the people sitting in the back and also those joining us online, because we have a sort of a interesting solution here with the microphone turned down to the microphone on the computer. So hopefully it will be loud enough. Let's see here. Does it play over there? Yeah, it's over there. Can you tell me if I'm close to it?
Hej! Ikväll ska jag vara med på klimatprat i Gävle. Dit kommer bland andra klimatforskaren Kevin Anderson, som just nu är ute på cykelturné, cyklar runt halva landet för att öka medvetenheten om klimatfrågor. Och jag tänkte så här att kan Kevin cykla genom halva landet så kan väl jag gå från Sandviken till Gävle.
What do you have on your bike here?
I have shoes, socks, shirt, a slightly warmer top. So everything you need for a week is sort of wrapped up in the bike here. But I will be wearing very similar clothes on a day-to-day basis. So it's a wash and the sink job.
What are you looking forward to the most?
Getting back safely. But hopefully, if the bike work goes well, then the presentations are reasonably well accepted, and good liaison with the various people turning up from companies and from civil society and so forth, and from local government. Then I can't really ask for more. I hope what I do is reasonably worthwhile and has good feedback, so I come back slightly wiser than I went, and hopefully I will provide some information to other people that they weren't aware of. Well, that's the end of the first formal day of the tour, with 3 presentations complete. The first this morning was in Lund with the commune and a fairly large set of civil servants, and it was pleasing to me to see the level of ambition that they have in terms of reducing emissions, but not just within the council itself, but across the full width of activities within the constituency. I then attended a public event in the afternoon and gave a presentation there, and again, as I often find in Sweden, the level of sort of can-do mentality amongst civil society was pleasing to see and witness. Challenging questions quite often, but certainly recognition of the scale of the challenge, and we discussed in some detail some of the obstacles that we faced, and I think most of the time we felt that we could actually overcome the obstacles. The biggest problem still, though, I think, was the time frame for delivering the rates of mitigation that were necessary, and I think there we still had some work to do in trying to marry the solutions that we had with how fast we could deliver them. Second day now of my tour, and I'm stopped here for a cup of tea after 110 kilometers or so with a family who live in the house behind me, which is a passive house. In other words, it uses no energy. The people living in it are just a normal family living a normal day-to-day life. So clearly there are plenty of things we can do with a bit of ingenuity, insight, and some political leadership. Yesterday morning and battled through 150 kilometres of incessant rain to arrive just in time in Gothenburg for a packed civil society event with a very vociferous and engaged audience. But what was particularly warming to me was to hear the very enlightened and thoughtful and insightful comments from a small panel of three. First, that understanding culture is really important if we are to drive rapid change in our society, but also that technology and culture are deeply entwined. We cannot see these things as separate. The final big issue, I think, yesterday was understanding the role of journalists and the media in informing the public about these issues, so that there can be reasoned debate, and particularly in this year of an election in Sweden. And thus far, the feeling was that journalists have broadly failed in this responsibility.
What do we need the politicians to bring into the coming election? I would say it's not any technical question. It's something else which I picked up from Kevin's talk, and that is courage. Because the transition is necessary, and it can be made. That's what Kevin also showed in his figures. But it really takes leadership and courage. Courage from our politicians, but also courage from us as citizens to embrace this transition.
Och jag önskar att vi skulle kanske lägga ifrån oss lite diskussionen kring elbilar och självkörande bilar och alla de där sakerna, och prata lite mer kollektivtrafik också. Mer tåg, mer bussar, bättre cykelvägar. Man kommer ganska långt med elcykel hela året runt. Det tycker jag.
Ja, det här med politiker i all ära, det är ju handling som räknas. Att snacka går ju, men liksom det är handlingen som räknas. Och politikerna förstår inte att vi vill mycket mer än vad de tror. Som institutet gör sina årliga undersökningar om vad vi oroar oss för. Och förra året var det klimat- och miljöproblem som var nummer 1. Och jag ser inte det i valrörelsen särskilt mycket.
Kevin raised a concern that we are moving way too slow and that our carbon budget is running out too fast. I agree with what Kevin was saying. However, I also think there is something to be remembered about how fast things change can happen, and in that it's exponential. 20 years ago, many were saying that wind energy would never ever be commercially viable and be able to compete with other energy sources, but today it's the cheapest. So I think that's a positive note to remember, is that change can happen very fast once it gets started.
Good morning, Isaac.
Good morning, Kevin. You've been out now for 2 weeks on the Swedish Carbon Cycle. Is this something you would ever do again?
Yes, certainly. I've learned a lot from it. I think the key message to me is that whether it's civil society or whether it's local policymakers in the communes and the lands, there's a real sort of desire to be putting in place the things that are necessary for Sweden to deliver on the Paris commitment. But there is also a strong belief across all of the communes that I visited that actually the real obstacles are the powers that they have, and that the national policymakers really are not that engaged in the real delivery. They appear to be, and I think this is a fair reflection from many of the people I've spoken to, that they're more interested in the sort of short-term, sort of rhetorical sponsors to the challenges, rather than actually putting in place the structure whereby the local councils and communities and civil society can start to make the changes that are necessary. So I think the real obstacle is not the population so much, and not the local policymakers, but it's much more the national framework. And they all have to come together. They've got to sort of mirror each other's concerns if we are going to address climate change. Sweden is actually looking to expand its aviation sector significantly and is building a new gas terminal at Gothenburg, which is locking Sweden into another 40 years, if not more, of high carbon fossil fuels. These are really not the sorts of signs of a progressive country in line with its Paris commitments. I think that's a strong message for the policymakers, that other people are looking to them to show some real leadership. Thanks so much, Isa. Right, have a good day.
You too.
So that was a short synopsis of the last 2 weeks for Kevin and other people around Sweden. And I think one of the interesting things there is, of course, that we're trying to bring these voices and these perspectives into the discussion here at Almedalen, which is a lot about the national politics and also this year of elections, of course, as well. So hopefully we'll get back to these questions a bit more in the panel later on. But before that, we have Kevin Anderson to listen to. So he's going to give his last talk, actually, on the Carbon Cycle tour. So this is where we ended up after 2 weeks of cycling and discussions. So a warm welcome to Kevin. Kevin, you've been in Sweden now for about 2 years, working with myself and other colleagues at Uppsala University, and hopefully we'll be working with you more up ahead as well. But this is sort of the end of your Zenström visiting professorship as well. So without further ado, I'll just let the mic over to you. Well, you have it on already. So
okay, thanks. Can you all hear me okay? Yeah. I have to say it's quite a sad day for me, really, the end of my 2 years here, but I'm hoping to extend it in various ways. I think if I had completely my own way, I'd be seeking out Swedish residency and try and stay here. But I would have to learn your very complicated vowel sounds. This is mostly a presentation, it relates to a presentation I gave at a number of the venues that I went to. Slightly different for some of the talks, but a lot of similarities. Actually, that's everything I carried. That's a week's supply. But except for the fact I did use quite a lot of soap in the hotels or bed and breakfast I was in to try and wash my clothes, because I only had one shirt and one. Yeah. So anyway, so I've called this here from Paris to Sweden, from Sweden to the land, and from the land to the communes, and then obviously here to Almedalen. And these are the people that put me through this torture. Isabel had the great idea just before she went off on holiday. Okay. So Isabel suggests, someone should go cycling, perhaps him. And Aaron was tasked with putting the itinerary together, and he did a really fantastic job, let's be honest about it. I was really impressed with how he did this, but he asked me, he said, how fast can you cycle? I said, about 32, 34 kilometers an hour. Sort of, that's what I do if I go out for a long ride, but I'm going fast with no luggage, which I forgot to mention. So Aaron just decided all my schedule on the basis that I would travel 32 kilometers an hour between each venue. There was never any time for getting out of the city. There was never any time for stopping for a coffee or having a pee in the woods or anything like that. You basically had to leave one place and cycle as hard as possible to get to the next place. It did mean I was quite stressed during some of the trips. And then Jesse also helped put some of the organisation together for the event. But they were a fantastic team to work with, as are all the people in CMUS. So I'm going to start off by outlining what I see as the international agenda, and then come into closer focus into Sweden. So what we have very clearly done in Paris in 2015 was we committed to firstly, to take action, which that language is in the report. So that's quite important. It doesn't say to just put a policy in place. It doesn't say to try and take action. It says to take action. So it's like a duty or an obligation. It's not a target or a goal. To hold the increase in global average temperature to well below 2 degrees centigrade of warming, and ideally aim for 1.5. Now, 2 degrees centigrade of warming on what has been 2 or 3 quite chilly days in Visby doesn't sound too much, but that is a global average, and the implications for the weather are huge at a 2 degrees C global average. That's 5, 6 degrees in the poles. That's the melting of the summer Arctic ice, which will change weather patterns around the globe. We've already seen the Antarctic melting much quicker, empirical evidence in the last few weeks. The Antarctic is melting much faster than we thought. So this will also mean ongoing increases of emissions from, of melting of sea ice in Antarctica. So massive weather changes, big changes to agriculture, big changes to human and ecosystem migration. 2 degrees centigrade is not safe. It is dangerous. Many people will die, and as I always point out, we know who they are. They're very low emitters. They live a long way from Sweden or the UK or the high emitting areas, and they're typically non-white. So we know who they are. And yet we've known this for a long time. And I think we have to just reflect on that. We've known that and not acted. And that's why those parts of the world, some of them collectively have asked us to aim for just 1.5 degrees centigrade of warming, because the impacts are much lower at 1.5. My judgment, very sadly, and I really am sad to say this, is that I don't think we can hold to 1.5. Let's try, but I think we're struggling to hold to 2 degrees centigrade if we're really honest at the moment. So, and I'll try and lay that out a bit more here. We've also agreed in Paris to do this in accordance with the best science, and I'll come back to that later because that's important, I think, for Sweden, and on the basis of equity. And no country in the world has seriously taken that final dimension, the equity part, on board, and that's included in the new Swedish climate change law, or indeed the UK Climate Change Act. So we're all so far ignoring the equity component in a serious fashion. So where do we? Well, I think before we go to what we need to do, I think it's important just to be honest about where we are today. I think we often start from a rose-tinted spectacle view of where we are. The first IPCC report came out in 1990. That's the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. That's a United Nations body that holds together or pulls together all of the climate science every few years. And the first report came out in 1992. We had the Earth Summit in 1990, the Earth Summit in 1992. So I'm looking at you here. Quite a few of you were still around then, but some of you weren't born, I would guess, in 1990. And that's quite important to think about. That means throughout your lives, we have known what to do on climate change and have chosen to fail. So I think that group, there's a constituency there that needs to be much more vociferous, much more engaged. My generation has chosen to fail, and your generation needs to remind us of that and push us much, much harder than we're prepared to accept at the moment. So there is some responsibility on you. It's your future, and hopefully mine with some stem cell research and medical improvements. But in 2016, carbon dioxide emissions were 60% higher than in 1990. So, that's 26 years, over a quarter of a century, and emissions have just gone up. And even in 2017, emissions were up 1.5%. So we've had lots of people come out talking about climate change. We've had lots of smiling policymakers and scientists and companies saying we're doing a lot. But actually what we've actually done collectively is had 28 years of abject failure on climate change. It's a very different picture to the optimism we often hear. And I think it's a much more honest position to say that's where we are today. That's not to say people haven't been trying. Some people have been trying incredibly hard to address things. But why have we fundamentally failed? And to me, in my very limited language, Swedish few number of words, there's this fantastic Swedish word, and I'll try and pronounce it right now, svindleri, is that right? Almost Swedish. So we've had a whole litany of these frauds, and we start off with things like offsetting, which is the same thing as sort of paying poor people to lose weight for us, to diet for us. So we don't want to save the carbon emissions, we'll pay someone else to do it. And we see that still when you have international conferences on climate change. They all say, the emissions from this conference are zero because we've offset the emissions. We've paid someone else to reduce the emissions for us. We've got the Clean Development Mechanism, which effectively is just state-sanctioned offsetting. So governments like the UK have said, well, rather than us reducing emissions, we'll pay Nigeria to reduce their emissions. We've had the emissions trading scheme. In principle, a good idea. So that's the trading between permits for carbon dioxide within the EU. But so many permits were issued, the price of carbon has remained virtually zero. So that's had very little impact. It's had some, but very little. Now we've got a lot of discussion, a lot in Sweden, about afforestation, planting more trees. Plant some more trees, build an airport. That's what Sweden's really planning along those sorts of lines. Build 2 airports, actually. And when all of this fails, which it inevitably will do and already has done over many years, lots of scientists and engineers and economists and now increasingly policymakers are coming together to discuss this thing called called negative emission technologies. I'm not going to focus on this today, but these do not exist. They're in the minds of and the concepts of engineers and scientists at the moment. And the plan is for future generations, not for them, for future generations to suck the carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere that we can't stop putting into there, that we claim we can't stop putting in. So these technologies do not exist, and they are basically embedded in all of the main models advising governments on what we need to do on climate change. So be very, very careful about those. They're often hidden in the small print. And when that fails, and I've only met one person who works on negative emission technologies who thinks that they will succeed at the level in the models. So even the people who work on it think the assumptions in the models are wrong. And so when that fails, we've already got engineers and scientists and again economists working out how we're going to reflect sunlight back out into space to provide some cooling. And the main technique at the moment is firing rockets into the stratosphere, the upper part of the atmosphere, and distributing sulfur particles, which we've spent the last 100 years trying to move out of the atmosphere. We're now going to put them back in, and these will reflect sunlight back out into space so we get some cooling of the planet. That's what we're planning now. What we haven't tried in 28 years is to reduce our carbon dioxide emissions. So, for some of you, right throughout your lives, we've tried everything else, but we haven't tried to reduce them. Now, it's easy to say, well, that's because of China or because of India, but it's not just because of those parts of the world. Yes, they are growing, and some people would say that's right, they should grow, and the emissions will go up. But let's look at Sweden, or the UK, or indeed France or Denmark, probably the 4 most progressive countries on climate change in the EU. So well known for their climate change discussion, maybe not action. Very low carbon electricity here in Sweden. And coming from the UK and spending my time in Sweden, I think Sweden is rightly seen as a progressive country. Okay, there are lots of things that are wrong with Sweden, no doubt. You would all point them out to me. But still, if you come from the UK, it still feels a more progressive country in many respects. So I think we have to recognise that. It partly deserved that reputation. But it remains a high carbon country. And in fact, what we've seen is no reduction in carbon dioxide emissions from Sweden since 1990. Now, you'll hear some policymakers and some what I would call co-opted scientists that have given up their science and partly now just talk politics, who will tell you, oh no, we've done much better than that. We've decoupled economic growth from our carbon emissions, but this is just nonsense. What they're doing is they're conveniently missing aviation and shipping emissions, which Sweden is planning to grow. They're conveniently missing the imports and the exports, so these microphones or, actually this shirt was Europe, but a lot of our clothes and other things that are made elsewhere in the world, and then we blame them for the emissions of making our laptops or whatever it might be. So if you take all of that into account, we've had no reduction. And if you look at Norway, it's up 40 to 50%. You look at Belgium, it's up 25%. So the EU has not been not a good model for what we should do. So once you've laid that picture out, that we've actually have failed, where do we go to from here? Well, the latest report from the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change made very clear that what really matters for us they didn't quite use this exact language, but the framing of carbon budgets rather than long-term targets. And it's carbon budgets that relate to a temperature. I'm not going to go into the sort of technical detail of them, but basically what that means is we have, for any given temperature, we have a total amount of carbon dioxide that we can emit from now out to forever. So it's a bit like having your income given to you in 1 year. Here's your income for life. And if you spend lots in the earlier part of your life, there'll be nothing left for later in your life. And that's the same for carbon dioxide. So for 2 degrees centigrade, we have a certain carbon budget we can spend. So focusing on the long term can be very misleading because the most important part of the carbon budget that we're spending is today. That's when it's going to be at its highest. So let's try and quantify the Paris Agreement. What we have historically are emissions going up. And before Paris, we were heading somewhere out there, 4 to 6 degrees centigrade of warming. That is a huge shift from the world in which we live today. With the Paris Agreement, emissions have dropped. Well, not emissions have dropped, but the trajectory, the pathway has changed to 3 to 4 degrees centigrade of warming, which is still like living on a different planet. That's not the same place we live now. That's still a sort of change you would expect to see over thousands, if not tens of thousands of years, not expect to see in 100 years. Remember, over modern human period, the last 10,000 years, we've only seen 1 degree centigrade of warming or change in temperature in that whole period. We're now higher than we've seen at any point during modern sort of person's human civilization. And it's also worth noting, the only reason we've moved from the upper curve to that one is not because of climate change policies, but it's because of what happened in 2007 and 8 with the banking crisis. And quite a few people are saying now it looks like global growth might be going back up, so our emissions might start going up to the higher curve. So we're not really making any major changes yet. But the IPCC have laid out quite clearly what sort of budget we have. How much carbon dioxide can we emit to stay at 2 degrees centigrade? And from 2018, if you make adjustment for that, we've got about 750 billion tons of carbon dioxide that we can emit globally. Now, let's not be too precise about that. That could be higher or it could be lower. And some scientists think it might be a bit higher than that, others think it'll be a bit lower than that. My guess, as someone looks at this data as well, I'm more on the lower side. I think that would probably be too optimistic. But that's the sort of central consensus view, something like that. And just to give a feel for it, because that probably means nothing to many of you, in 2017 we emitted 42 billion tons at a global level. So a bit of maths, I'll show you, that's about 18 years. That requires zero carbon energy by around 2050, there or thereabouts. And remember, that's everything. That's not just electricity. That's trains, planes, ships, industry, everything. All our energy, zero carbon. Now, I'm not focusing today on agriculture. Agriculture is a really important part of the picture. About 20% of the warming we've seen so far, there or thereabouts, comes from agricultural-related emissions. They can be reduced significantly by clever agricultural practices, by reducing our use of meat, our consumption of dairy. So there are plenty of things we can do, but we can never eliminate emissions from agriculture. And that's one of the reasons we have to eliminate emissions from energy. Now, we also signed up, as I said in the beginning, to do this on the basis of equity. And what we've said repeatedly from the Kyoto Protocol in '97 right the way through to the latest agreement in Paris and again in Bonn last year is that the wealthy parts of the world will make this transformation, this transition to zero carbon energy ahead of the poorer countries. And everyone sort of nods and says, yes, of course we will. So that we've all signed up to do this. But that has some big implications. So when we start to pull the science together with our commitment on equity, what would that look like for Sweden? Well, one way to think about this is that for 2 degrees centigrade or for any other temperature, we have a set amount of carbon dioxide. So this is the carbon dioxide that we can emit globally. And this is a Manchester pie rather than a Swedish bula. So you have to imagine what it would look like if it was a bula. And these carbon emissions come from every country in the world. So not just convenient ones, but everyone. And we have to decide, how do we divide that? How do we divide that out? And what's interesting there, we send our negotiators, so the negotiator for the EU or America or for Nigeria or for Morocco or wherever, they go to these big meetings every year and they argue with each other about how big their slice should be. And that's failed. So really, when you think about it, philosophy tells us something here. And I think we have to start to think about these things differently. If the negotiators negotiated for another part of the world. So imagine the Chinese negotiator negotiating for the US negotiator negotiating for the EU negotiator negotiating for Morocco, the Morocco one negotiating for Australia. Then you get to negotiate, and what you will find from rules in philosophy is that you'll probably get a fairly good and fair division of the pie. So we actually know how to do these things, but instead everyone sends their negotiator and asks them to get a biggest bit of the pie you possibly can. And you add that up, and you need 2 or 3 pies. So we know how to do these things, but again, politically, we just don't have the courage to go ahead and do it in ways that we know would work. So what would a fair slice look like for the EU? That's a question we've asked with Isaac and other colleagues in CEMUS and also in my colleagues in Manchester. And it's not a precise amount. It depends how you divide the global cake. You could divide it on population, but that's probably a bit unfair given that the wealthy countries have caused most of the problem. You could do it on historical emissions, you could do it on their recent emissions, the size of their economy. There are different ways to divide the cake. So you get a slice, and it could be a bit bigger or a bit smaller than that. So I've just shown one slice here, but we used a range of numbers. And then we asked the question, how much of that slice should Sweden get? And again, you can divide that out on different rules. And when you do that, you get a range of somewhere between 300 and 600 million tonnes for Sweden from now, in fact, not from now, from January the 1st of this year, right the way through to forever. That's our total emissions. And I would say the 600 is too generous, really. That's based on population. I think we need to be nearer this end, maybe 300 to 450 million tonnes. The emissions in 2016 from Sweden, including aviation and shipping, were about 50 million tonnes. So 6 to 12 years of current emissions, and there'll be nothing left from Sweden, one of the most progressive countries in the world, in relation to its 2°C commitment, which in any way is very dangerous for many people around the world. You start to look at it and think, well, that sounds challenging, but actually the implications of failure are much worse. Now, this does include aviation, and it does include shipping emissions, and I'll come back to those later. They are really important, and Sweden is planning to increase those, as are almost every other part of the world. Both those sectors expect to double their emissions by 2050, even with efficiency improvements. But it doesn't include imports and exports. Now, these are really important. So things like the laptop here, or this little pointer. So these are important issues, but firstly, we don't control them directly. So if you have a laptop made in China, we can't tell the Chinese yet what sort of power system they would have to use. We can't control whether we import it or not. It's under WTO rules. So there are quite a lot of constraints there. So firstly, we don't control it directly, and second, there's a big variation in the estimates. So we know our territorial emissions, what happens in our boundaries, very accurately, but globally, Sweden probably emits about between 80 million and 100 million tonnes. That's a big range. But it's still, if you notice, even at the lower end, it's still far more than our territorial emissions. 50 million tonnes within our territory, 80 million to 100, if you take account of all of Swedish people's lives. So it's a big difference. So though I don't say we should focus on this, I would say it's really important to be guided by it. If our territorial emissions come down, but our best estimate of the consumption emissions are going up, then we're doing something wrong. So we have to be guided by it. We can also then say, well, we've got a Swedish position. What do we think should we do for the lands and the communes? So you could ask the question, we are asking this question, Isaac and I and others, at the moment, how much should Gotland get? And we're not saying that's a fair piece for Gotland, though it would get quite a big slice because it's got a cement industry here. So you would then look at the different regions in Sweden and say, well, what should their part be? And we're doing this, we've had a workshop and we've had discussions with a number of lands and communes across Sweden, and quite a few of these now have asked us to produce a carbon budget for them, and we provisionally have done one for the Järfälla commune last year at their request. So we're doing this work now to say what would the budgets look like, and how do you divide them up within Sweden. So that's, I think, important work, because ultimately policies that are effective are driven at the local and the regional level, with the national framework putting the umbrella in, if you like, within which the others work. So let's go back to the headline mitigation message for Sweden and say, what would that look like? Well, it's about 10 to 15% reduction in our carbon emissions every single year, starting now. And we're being quite generous here, really. We've put the 10% in just as a gentle starter. Within sort of 3 years, you really need to be at about 15% reduction every year. To give a feel for that, that's about 70 to 75% reduction by 2025. So imagine 3/4 of our emissions taken out of the system in the next 7 or 8 years. And it's not just the ones that are convenient. This is all of our emissions we're focusing on here. We need to be fully decarbonised. That's 0 emissions, not low emissions. Low emissions of carbon dioxide is not good enough. Low emissions means an ongoing rise in temperature, because the carbon dioxide we emit will be there, a large part of it, from any real sense forever. So people often think carbon dioxide is only there for 100 years. About 20% of the carbon dioxide we emit today will be there for 10,000 years. So we are changing the climate pretty much forever when we emit. So 0 carbon, planes, ships, industry, everything. So how does that compare with the Swedish climate change law? And let's give Sweden credit. It's really good that it's got this law in place. It needs now to be tightened and refined with the latest sort of science and information we have. But the best estimate that Isaac, I and other colleagues can make is that if you take the Swedish Environmental Protection Agency sort of estimates, it's probably something like a 6% per annum reduction in emissions. But this excludes aviation and shipping emissions. It doesn't have a carbon budget framework beneath it, so I would argue it's not really that scientifically robust about what needs to be done. And it effectively ignores equity, as does every other part of the world. So it's not just Sweden. If you look at the Rockström carbon, he did with a paper he wrote with colleagues earlier this year, I think it was this year, or end of last year, about 7% per annum is what he suggests is necessary globally. But both of these include negative emission technologies, so there's an assumption behind them, some of them more explicit than others, that negative emissions are there. The Rockström paper makes it very clear, and he is assuming a very large uptake of negative emission technologies as sucking CO2 out in the future. But really he's not, because Rockström is about the same age as me, give or take a few years. He's not planning to do that. He's planning to be retired when these technologies are put in place by the next generation. And I think it is important to bear that in mind, that it's my generation that are recommending these negative emission technologies to the next generation. Again, that's something to think about. So these don't exist. It also excludes issues of equity. So you cannot just say the global law should apply to Sweden. That would be very unfair to do that. So what we've done at CMUS is try to say, well, let's not ignore negative emission technologies. Let's research them. Let's spend a lot of money researching how viable they may be. But let's assess what we would need to do, assuming that they will not work, because they probably won't work at the scale we expect. So we said exclude negative emissions, but let's include equity. We've promised other parts of the world that's what we would do. And let's include planes and ships. I mean, if you're not going to include all of our emissions, well, why not just miss out cars as well, and heating, and anything else that's difficult? So we have to include everything, really. And if you do that, you can see why we don't want to do it, because you get the red curve, and the red curve is just massively challenging. So if you're a policymaker, you're trying to sell this to your electorate, which one would you prefer? If you're a climate change scientist who likes flying to essential international conferences, which one would you prefer? If you're a Swedish citizen who likes going to Bali for some sunshine, which one would you prefer? We all like the ones that aren't red. Now, I don't want to be picking on Sweden, because if we went to the UK, and in this particular case, I think the UK has been well ahead of Sweden. I think the Swedish climate change law is worth having, but it's not as well developed as the one in the UK was, and that was put in place in 2008. That's the law. We haven't delivered so much in the UK. So this is our one for the UK, and we have 5-year carbon budgets as well there. And if you take away all the noise from that, just to give a feel for what it looks like, and then put 2 degrees centigrade on, it's the same thing. Basically, 2 of the most progressive countries in the world that actually have a climate change law, they are planning on really a 3 or 4 degree C future. So nothing like a 2 degrees centigrade. So what would it take if we were to seriously deliver on Paris? If we now were saying, well, okay, let's rethink this, and from this point onwards, we're going to try and do what's necessary. So the first thing is we have to make immediate changes to our emissions. We can't wait for tomorrow. So we need to do something today, tomorrow, and the day after. So we have to start immediately. And it's worth bearing in mind that emissions are hugely skewed to particular groups in society. And I'm pretty sure, having wandered around Almedalen yesterday, looking at some of the things that are here, that the emissions of people arriving in Almedalen are massively skewed to certain groups of people that are here. It's not everyone attending that will be high emitters. At a global level, the top 10% of emitters are responsible for 50% of global emissions. That comes out of the really fantastic report by Lucas Chancel and Thomas Piketty in 2015. So it's really a report well worth looking at. And if that 10% reduced their carbon footprint, and they would have to do it by force, by regulation, they wouldn't do it voluntary, I'm sure, to the level of the average European, that's a 1/3 cut in global emissions. And I think that just shows you how much the emissions are skewed to particular groups of people. So whilst we all have some responsibility, some have much, much greater responsibility than others. Remember, we've come together to say no reduction in emissions by 2030. If you add the Paris promises together, that's the same emissions in 2030 as we have today, roughly. That'd be 1/3 cut just for that 10%. And we can aim our policies at them because we know who they are. So, climate scientists. Now, these are cartoons of them. I know some of these people quite well. This one here and this one here regularly flies business and first class and has a premier flight card They're climate scientists are telling other people to reduce their emissions. So they spend a lot of their time on planes, going to meet each other. That's who they meet. They don't meet other people. They meet each other at these conferences. But then just behind them, or probably mostly in business class, maybe, I don't know about Swedish policymakers, the policymakers are there. And the business leaders, so all the great and good, are flying around the world and meeting up in Davos and other places saying we must do something about climate change. I'm just guessing quite a few of the Almedalians are in that particular group as well. And basically, I don't want to, it's not all about aviation, but aviation is emblematic. It symbolises people who are high emitters. If you fly quite regularly, twice a year, then you're in the very high emitting group. Because we can guarantee people who fly a lot don't live in a really small house and only ever use public transport. They almost always are people who live in bigger houses or aspiring to even bigger houses, have quite big cars, and all the other high emission activities in their lives. So it symbolises it. But that is not enough. We can do a lot by driving our changes in our behaviour and our practices, not just in aviation, many other things as well. But we also need to make sure that everything that we buy, when we have to replace something, is as efficient as possible. Now, when you've got the students out in a lecture, they've often got their laptops out. If you ask them to compare their laptops, you'll find that some use almost twice as much energy as other ones. You look at an A-rated refrigerator and compare that for the same size with an A+++ refrigerator, and you'll see there's a 60 to 80% reduction in energy consumption. So we know this, whether it's cars, we see this massive difference in the efficiency of cars, or refrigerators, or laptops, all these things that get replaced quite regularly as well, that if we drove efficiency then, we could really improve things. So tighten the standards for all appliances, and they can only be sold if they meet that standard. Tighten it every year. You provide a long-term market signal for companies, so they will be able to deliver that. They know what they've got to do. They know their innovation plan for the next 10 or 15 or 20 years. And if you combine the technology, which can do a lot on the demand side, with the behaviour, then I would argue that in 40 to 70 years, in 10 to 15 years, we can have reductions in our energy consumption of 40 to 70%. And remember, that will again be skewed towards those who mostly use the energy today. Because like the emissions, there's few people that use a lot of the energy. But we also, of course, need low-carbon supply, energy supply, which is what we always focus on. And there's a whole suite of these things, from geothermal, wind, nuclear, hydro, and solar panels. And all of these are very low carbon. They're all about 5 to 15 grams of carbon dioxide for every kilowatt hour, compared with a gas-fired power station, which is about 450 grams, and a coal power station about 900 grams. And if you use carbon capture and storage, which a lot of people are planning for, with a fossil fuel, it's probably about 100 to 200 grams. So basically, all of those are too high, except for this sort of group here, in 5 to 15 grams. But at a global level, these provide about 20% of the energy we consume. And in Sweden, they provide about 30%. So about 70% of the energy we consume in Sweden, or indeed France as well, is not electricity. So we need a massive electrification program, significantly in Sweden for transport, and in the UK, transport and heat. And this will take quite a long time to put all this in place, so sort of like a retooling of society's productive capacity towards zero CO2 future. So in terms of looking at the policymakers, what should they focus their attention on? Here's just some little sort of simple examples of the sorts of things we need to be thinking about. We're not just thinking about acting on, I should say, today. The first one is all of the older buildings that we have need to be retrofitted suitable for the 21st century. Lots of buildings in Sweden will continue to be used right throughout this century. They need to be appropriate for the 21st century. In other words, much lower energy consumption. So we need to retrofit those buildings. We need to make sure our towns and our cities do not have lots of cars driving around them. Even electric cars, I would argue, are a mistake. So let's move towards public transport, walking, cycling, electric bikes, and let's build our cities around people rather than around cars. We need passive house standards for all of our new buildings. Sweden has many new houses being built, and flats and commercial buildings. These need to be zero carbon. The one I visited on the way down to Gothenburg was built 14 years ago. It cost 20% more to build. 20%, that's all. The price you pay for the building is far more than the build cost. So it's almost lost, just 20%. A normal house, normal family, and no heating for 14 years in Sweden. It's quite impressive. So all new buildings should be at that standard, and not in 10 years' time. They need to be that now. We need to make sure we have good charging infrastructure. I would argue for bikes in towns and cities and the rural environment for cars, because often cars can be better than public transport in the rural environment. So let's make charging system for cars in the rural place. We need to significantly reduce our flying and not be expanding our airports, which, to be honest, is a disgrace for Sweden. We need no more business and first-class flights, or train journeys, because they use somewhere between 2 to 3 times as much energy if you go business or first class compared with standard class. So very high emissions. We need to have virtual communication that actually works really efficiently, and not just in special places, not just at work or in special rooms, but everywhere that we go, in our homes, in our cafes, at our places of work. So it's something we get just used to using rather than having to travel, and it makes sure it works very well, because often it does not. And of course we need low carbon energy supply, and it is a real shame to me to come to Visby and see almost no solar panels. The energy consumption this week, next week, and for the next 2 or 3 weeks will be really high in Visby, in Gotland, and yet there's virtually no solar panels here. At the same time that the sun shines a lot this time of year. They would match really well. So why is Visby not doing that? And I know people will tell me it's about conservation values, but there are plenty of places down by the port that are clearly not conservation areas. And there are places just outside the wall that are not conservation areas, so we can put them up there. Now, this can be sold, I think, as a really progressive agenda. We can write a storyline for policymakers along this, which is really positive, or storylines, many of them. This provides long-term, high-quality employment for our children and our children's children. This is something that certainly in many other parts of Europe, Southern Europe and the UK definitely, and the US of course, that jobs are an important criteria for voters, for policymakers. They want people to vote and the people for them, and the people that will vote for them are the ones you make sure they've got good jobs. So here we have a great jobs agenda. We improve the the quality of the air in our urban environment, which is good for our children's health when they're growing up. Surely most parents would like their children to have better quality air in the cities. And Swedish cities are also quite polluted from car traffic. We would provide a stronger sort of staycation industry, whereby rather than having our money just flying abroad when we go on holiday, we'd actually spend it much more in our own country. And in the UK, I know the estimates are there, for every £1 of tourist money that flies in, £2.73 flies out. And I'm sure that Sweden is the same. So let's start to build an industry whereby people want to stay in Sweden rather than flying abroad as often. As well as, of course, high-speed trains, or night trains, even better, into continental Europe. You provide a prosperous and healthy future for our children. Probably quite good to parents if you're trying to collect their votes. And this is Sweden's fault, really. Sweden is a progressive country. People don't look at it as 10 million people. They see it as somewhere that's supposed to show some leadership. And I think on climate change it's failed. But if it starts to drive the sort of agenda I'm talking about here, then Sweden will be seen as a very progressive country as well, which, I think, is its right reputation. But on climate change, it is failing. So to conclude, climate change is system change. It wasn't in 1990, it wasn't in 1992. Because every year we chose to fail, you eventually use up almost all of your carbon budget, and then it becomes an issue of massive government intervention. And that's where we are now. So it wasn't always system change, but it is today. If we follow the logic, the science of climate change, which of course the Swedish government are bought into when they signed the Paris Agreement, and we take account of equity, then it does ask questions about our norms and our paradigms, the things that we think of as normal activity, the sorts of behaviour that we have that we just think, well, of course that's okay, everyone does that. We need to transform our energy system very rapidly to low carbon and zero carbon energy. We need a rapid penetration of energy efficient technologies. So you can only buy technologies that are very, very efficient, and they will be tightened every single year. We need huge shifts, profound shifts in the behaviours and the practices of high emitters. One of the events I was at recently at KTH, looking at sustainable campuses, pointed out that from their survey work, that a professor emits 10 times more than a PhD researcher, and 5 times more than a postdoc. So you just think, and when you think about that, who are the most useful people with inspiring ideas? The one group you can tell, guarantee it will not be the professors. Grey-haired old men generally do not have any more inspiring ideas. They had them when they were younger, with some notable exceptions, in case anyone's worrying about. Yet they are the high emitters. So we need to change our behaviours and our practices. But that fits really significantly into this. And this is a broader sustainability concern, but climate change fits it very well as too. And that is that we've got to start to rethink what do we see as success and progress. We've got the Russian World Cup at the moment. I know very little about football. I know that footballers, at least the ones going there, will be very well paid. We hold them up as these wonderful people. And yet they are probably some of the highest emitters in the world, as are the bankers, the business leaders, the professors, the vice-chancellors. The people we see as successful in our society, and certainly somewhere like the UK, are those with very high carbon footprints. Those that have big houses, big cars, large holiday homes, fly business class. They are not measures that we should be using for success. They are the ones that are causing the problems. We've got to rethink what we mean by success and progress in our society. And I would suggest that Sweden is already further ahead than places like the UK and the US on that. So there's some good signs here, but I would argue it's going the wrong way. That's my impression anyway. So we need to rethink that. And we need an economics that's fit for purpose. The current economic model is simply not suitable for the task that we're trying to perform. I often point out with the current economic model, which I've spent a lot of time researching in the past, it tells you a lot about competing high street shops who sell shoes. That's it. It tells you a lot about that world. It tells you nothing about what energy system you should build. When you build an energy system in Sweden, people in Bangladesh are impacted by it. That form of economics tells us nothing about system-level issues. It can't address those. It's the wrong tool for the job. There are other forms of economics, steady-state economics, ecological economics, that allow us to think about those issues. Current mainstream economics is simply not suitable. This needs to start now, be completed in 3 decades. And we've got a long, long way to go. So, I'm sorry, I forgot about that slide. And actually, that's particularly important now we're in Almedalen. What you hear repeatedly at events, or like occasions like this, are that, well, here's the real politic. Well, the real politic is just a made-up politic. It's not real. The real thing is actually the climate, or physics. We've had, on this planet, we've had the climate affecting what we do for the last 3.5 billion years. We've had the laws of physics for the last 13 billion years. This real politic is a post-war consensus at best, probably only the last 30 or 40 years. This is short-lived. This isn't. So let's focus on this and move away from this real politic. And we've got a long way to go. Let's not be too optimistic. Perhaps I've been too optimistic. But do we really care about people living elsewhere in the world today who are suffering from the impacts of climate change? That's a photograph that I took yesterday at the dock down here. This is Almedalen. That is a disgrace. No one's putting graffiti on them or putting, or doing other things to them to say, big signs on them or flags attached to them saying that these shouldn't be here. They're just sat there showing off in the Almedalen dock. Do we care about our own children when that was just up the road here yesterday? Do we really require? It's a huge 4-wheel drive Land Rover. And the other thing about it, there was not one scratch on it. It was polished. It wasn't as if it was being used for doing anything that it was designed for. It's just for carrying lumps of useless flesh around Almedalen. Do we think that's reasonable? Do we care about our children's future? Do we care about other species when Sweden, a country that's so progressive and thinks about these issues, is building a new gas terminal? That needs to be stopped now. That means we have to campaign to our policymakers saying, do not build the gas terminal. And people will tell you it's going to be used for biogas in the future, for importing biogas. And that's pretty much nonsense as well. There's not going to be that much biogas around to be exporting around the world. Do we care about our own planet as we get on another plane to go to a climate change conference or to Bali or to Thailand or some other essential place we must visit for some relaxation or work? Ultimately, we're in this position that comes from a discussion I had with Alex Steffen a couple of years ago. Winning slowly is basically the same thing as losing outright. In the face of both triumphant denialism, which we don't see so much in Sweden or across Europe, but we see it in the States and Australia, and predatory delay, we see lots of that. How can we possibly delay action? That's repeatedly what we hear. Trying to achieve climate action by doing the same things, the same old ways, means defeat. It guarantees defeat. We are guaranteeing defeat at the moment. And Almadal in the discussions here need to start to take climate change seriously. It shouldn't just be in climate change discussions that we discuss climate change. Almost every single presentation discussion in Almadal should have a climate change dimension to it. But it'd be interesting to see how many of them have. But that's probably a bit too depressing, so I'll finish off with my favourite quote from Robert Unger, that at every level, the greatest obstacle to transforming the world is that we lack the clarity and imagination to conceive that it could be different. And I've used this quote for years, and one of my Irish colleagues pointed out recently, is it really valid anymore? And I think he's got a point. Actually, I do think we've got a pretty good idea about what a low-carbon, prosperous future would look like for our children. They'd all be a bit different, and so they should be, but we've got some sort of idea. I also think we've got some idea now about how to get there. What we lack is the courage to put that in place, the collective courage. So, in fact, almost at every level, whether it's the individual, whether it's our institutions, our universities, they're terrible on this, or whether it's our policymakers or our companies, we're all failing. No one's had the courage to step forward and make the changes. So perhaps that's all we're lacking, really, is courage.